Thank you all for coming today. We have Matt and Tom Gillespie here with us. They're going to present according to the agenda in front of you. I think all of you have met. If not, take time at the end of the meeting. We'll mingle. We have a lot to get through on the agenda, so we're just going to get started. Please note we are going to be recording this for future, just so everyone knows. I want to make sure you all know, and that's why we have the microphone sporadically set in front of you. If you have questions, just please use the microphone so we can gather that and capture that. So with that, that's it. Come on up, Matt. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to thank you for taking some time out of your Thursday afternoon. We all met a number of times now, and you kind of have a sense of where we are in the project. With that in mind, I'd like you to think back to the last presentation we did and see if you have any questions about what you've seen so far. Anything that's been kind of chewing at you since our last meeting? And you don't have to answer right now, but maybe there's an opportunity later to respond to that. But you know, as we talk about the information today, and as you think back, if it spurs anything, just keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll be sure to answer those questions either today or in another format. I just want to give you a little bit of an update about where we're at in the schedule. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of hiccups at our center. As you know, in our email, we've lost our graduate student to another job. So Lindsay is no longer with us. So we are trying to get back on schedule with the work that she was doing, and you'll see some of it today. She was working on some of the cost of community service spreadsheets, as well as some of the other work that you'll see here today. Unfortunately, our center's also lost two people indefinitely for health reasons, so we're kind of shorthanded here as well. So just keeping that in mind, I just ask that you have a little patience. We're trying to do the best we can. We want to give you a really good project. This is a real high priority for us. So please don't think that because we're a little bit behind in the schedule that this work is not important to us. We want to make sure that you get a good product, and we need your input to do that as well. So with that, I'd like to start by talking about some of the projection work that Tom has been doing. As you know, we did a couple of different population projections. We have our state Department of Administration Population Service Center that does state projections, county projections, and municipal projections out to the year 2040, but we thought it would be a good idea to bring in another source and kind of see if those differed, if they were the same, what they looked like. So we'd have a couple of options to look at in terms of what population might look like going forward in the corridor. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tom. I'll let you do a full introduction of yourself, but Tom is formerly with the state of Minnesota, and he is an economic demographer. Did I get that correct? So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
You bet.
Good afternoon, everyone. See, I guess that up. Okay. By way of introduction, I worked for the state of Minnesota. I was a state demographer in Minnesota for 35 years, and retired 2 years ago. Do a few things like this, but normally I don't. But when St. Croix County called, this is like next door. So I live across the river in just west of Stillwater. So I get to see the construction going on all the time and have to deal with Minnesota's Highway 36 on an almost daily basis. So it seemed to be an interesting kind of thing to look at. Okay, that's all up. Okay, so so basically this is the kind of thing I've been doing for a very long time, and I hope if you have any questions, please let me know. This is not my first time to do county level projections. Wanted to talk first just a little bit about the history of St. Croix County. and some of the critical elements. There certainly has been a tremendous amount of population growth in the last few decades in St. Croix County, and particularly we saw rapid growth during the 1990s and the first half of last decade, so that by 2013, the most recent Census Bureau estimate, the county stands at nearly 86,000 people in total population. If we look at growth from year to year rather than looking at just a straight line, what we see is dramatic changes. One is that St. Croix County had been growing at a fairly strong clip of around 2% a year, going back into the 70s and through the 80s, as people were moving here and the county continued to expand in population. And then during the 1990s really began to take off, and we saw a growing rate of population. Is there something? Did I do something wrong? Oh, okay. Okay. You have the handout. A growing rate of population growth, and so that by early last decade, 2001, 2, 3, 4, that we were looking at about a 4% growth rate per year, which is an extremely rapid pace of growth in population, and through much of particularly the first half of last decade and even back into the 90s, St. Croix County was one of the fastest growing counties in the nation, one of the 100 fastest growing counties in the nation, along with some other Twin City metropolitan area counties of Isanti and Chisago to the northwest of here, and Wright and Sherburne and Scott and Carver on the far western edge of the Twin City metropolitan area. Extremely rapidly growing area, and by comparison to other frost belt areas, not by comparison to the Sun Belt, places like Houston, Texas continue to grow at unreasonable paces, but by comparison to frost belt metropolitan areas, no other metropolitan area in the frost belt had a number of counties in that top 100 fastest growing county category, and St. Croix was one of those counties. And then something happened. It really started about 2006 in the housing market. In the general economy, we noticed it in 2008. And of course, now we talk about that as the Great Recession. And one of the things that we saw was a dramatic slowing in the rate of growth in migration in the number of people moving to St. Croix County. Now, there's a couple different sources of information on migration. One of the sources is actually IRS data matching returns from one year to the next and matching the address on that, and they can actually get some information on the number of filers and the number of exemptions claimed, the number of person exemptions claimed on those forms. What we saw was that the number of people moving out of St. Croix County remained pretty constant at about 3,000 a year. Most of those people are young people going off to college and older people moving to warmer climates in general. The vast majority of that would be the young people going off to college, and that number remained fairly constant over the last decade. The number that really changed was the number of people moving into St. Croix County, and that dropped from over 5,000 a year to around 3,000 a year by the end of 2 years ago and in the last few years. So that what we're seeing right now is basically a situation of zero net migration. That about as many people move out as move into St. Croix County. This is not an unusual situation by comparison to other counties in the Twin City metropolitan area, nor is it unusual by comparison to trends that we are seeing on a national basis. It is not just in the Twin Cities we're seeing this, we are seeing this over the entire nation. Even in the fastest growing of the Sun Belt metropolitan areas, we've seen dramatic slowing in the rate of growth of those newly emerging suburbs, that moving outward that has really stopped. And the state that was the fastest growing state in the nation for a couple decades, Nevada, is no longer the fastest growing. Nevada is growing at about the pace of Minnesota right now. And the fastest growing state in the nation, I don't know, can anybody venture a guess? North Dakota. North Dakota, a state that was actually declining in population over much of the 90s, is now the fastest growing state in the nation in population. Things can change, and things can change dramatically. Well, one of the things that we have seen like I say, not just in the Twin City metropolitan area, but throughout many metropolitan areas all over the nation, is a dramatic rate of slowing in the growth rate of those rapidly growing suburban and ex-urban communities, while at the same time the core cities are beginning to see some increase in growth. So that we are seeing right now Minneapolis and St. Paul actually beginning to grow. They hadn't grown in a long time. They're actually beginning to, that's that green line that comes on and off here once in a while. That we're seeing actually some increase in growth, and that those cities and the inner ring suburbs around the Twin Cities are now growing at a faster rate than the counties that had been among the fastest growing counties in the nation. Basically, right now, urban sprawl is a term that some people have used. Urban sprawl is not happening. It has not been happening since about 2006. Will it come back? Will we begin to get back to the environment where we see rapid expansion outward in suburban areas? That right now is open to question. We may have seen a dramatic shift in the long run trends in our society. There are some major factors I wanted to go over just very quickly before I get to the actual projections. Some major factors that affect current and future population growth in counties such as St. Croix County. The housing market is still being affected by the recession. There are still people that are underwater in the housing market. That has greatly reduced the outward expansion of population, but also many people have been psychologically affected. It is not just the financial aspect; it's that we have learned something, that a new truth. Up until about 2006 to 2008, we were all absolutely certain that housing prices could never decline. And now we're pretty certain that they can. And that has had a dramatic impact on people's expectations as to where they want to move. A second factor that is affecting migration, or affecting population growth right now, is that people aren't moving as much, that fewer and fewer people are moving. And one of the factors that affects the number of people moving is that we are an aging society. We are now experiencing record numbers of people retiring from the workforce, and the simple fact of it is that old people tend not to move. That is the least likely group of people to move in our society. The most likely to move are young adults and people, particularly people in their 20s and 30s. So overall, migration has slowed down in the nation. And once older people do move, they tend to move either towards the Sun Belt, to warm places, or they move into more densely settled areas. They move inward towards the big cities. Generation X, it's that generation that was born in the late 60s and through most of the 70s, is now in their mid 30s to about age 50, with the smallest age group age 44. And this is sort of the prime age group to move into a county like St. Croix County. And so that generation right now is a very small generation nationwide. That is a national phenomenon. The next generation up, the people that are going to really be hitting the housing market theoretically in the future, is the millennial generation. These are the people that are now in their early 30s down to their teens. The millennial generation is a much larger generation than Gen X. Depending on how you measure it, they're either more or less than the baby boom generation. But these are the kids, the children of the baby boom generation. And they were largely born in the 1980s and 1990s. As it turns out, they have, based on survey data, national survey data, a radically different view of housing, and not just housing, but almost everything else, than the four preceding generations. And one of the differences is that is perhaps most interesting for today's discussion, is that in terms of housing preferences, they want smaller houses closer in. They want to spend less time commuting. They want to spend less time maintaining a house. They want to spend less of their income on housing, and they want that generally in a more centralized urban environment. And then finally, one of the things that there are just numerous articles occurring about this right now. There's actually a couple reports out today on this, is that residual debt, particularly student debt, is slowing down the housing market and having a dramatic impact. And until we make some decisions on a national basis on how to pay for higher education, things like that, that will continue to be a long run drag on the housing market.
What factor I don't see on that list is immigration. How much of a factor does that play? And say for the two courses, Minneapolis, that is a significant factor.
That immigration has been, the Twin City metropolitan area has had, by sort of upper Midwest measures, a fairly substantial immigration by national standards, a very small immigration. Much of the people that are immigrating to the United States are immigrating to places like California, New York, Texas, Florida. That's the vast majority, and that's where the real focus of immigration is occurring. But we do receive immigrants coming into the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. The expectation right now by the Census Bureau, and they just revised in the last year, revised their long-run forecast, is that number of immigrants is going to be much lower than what we had anticipated 10 years ago. Now, some of us have been talking about this for a long time, and I would be happy to talk to anybody about this, and the implications of this for the workforce and for housing and all sorts of other things after this meeting. But basically, what the situation is Europe is declining in population. China is about to decline in population. Japan is declining in population. Much of Latin America is beginning to age right now. Mexico will have a fertility rate below that of the United States by the end of this decade. And they're beginning to experience less and less migration. We actually have a net outflow from the United States to Mexico based upon the best estimates that we have. That includes both authorized and unauthorized immigration. So the expectation is that immigration is going to be less of a factor than we thought that it was going to be. But all these projections do include people that are moving here from other countries as well as from the United States. Okay. Okay, 5 minutes and boot it down? Okay, this is a good place to stop. So 5 minutes, we're gonna try to fix the computer. That's be the shortest computer fix in history.
Sorry about that, thank you.
Sorry about the delay. When in doubt, check the plugs, make sure they're all plugged in. Okay. Before I start talking about St. Croix County specifically, let me just mention that the projections from at least the Minnesota State Demographer, not me, but the new one, that was done, released actually this summer, for the counties in the Twin City metropolitan areas not in Wisconsin. These are only the Minnesota. This is only the Minnesota portion. But basically, their projections show continued growth of the Twin City metropolitan area, but at a slower and slower pace that is also consistent with national projections, which would suggest a slower and slower pace of growth, with the west half of the western portion of the metropolitan area growing at a slightly faster pace than the eastern portion, but not a dramatically different number. Okay. Projecting St. Croix County. The method I used is a cohort component method that actually turns out to be a pretty good method for counties, and one of the advantages is that it also gives you information on the age breakdown over time, so that schools and other organizations that are particularly interested in certain components of the population find that to be a very useful type of projection. St. Croix County is not dramatically different in terms of its birth and death characteristics, and though not different from Minnesota and Wisconsin. Minnesota and Wisconsin tend to be a little different from the rest of the country in mortality characteristics. We tend to be much longer lived, and well, that's just a long-term factor, is that people from Minnesota and Wisconsin just tend to be healthier and longer lived. So we're using that information and forecasted fertility rates that are consistent with the fertility rates used for Minnesota and Wisconsin, and trends consistent with trends for a national basis. The main factor of growth in St. Croix County, and the main source of variation from year to year or decade to decade, is in migration, and so one of the things I looked at was profile by age and gender by decade for the last 60 years, to develop alternative assumptions and profiles based upon, to some extent, the history of St. Croix County, but also in terms of its profile, but also understanding that going forward is going to look a little different than going backwards. I developed 4 models, primarily based on, well, totally based on differences in migration characteristics. Model 1 is a very slow start kind of model. Remember, the bridge is not going to be completed for at least another year, if not 2 years, and there may be residual operations continuing to work on that. And some of the current economic situation in the housing market is not suggesting there's a dramatic change in the housing market over the next few years, and so this model would assume that the next 5 years be pretty much like the last 5 years, which is a period of extremely slow migration into St. Croix County, but then followed by a 5-year period of really what I would call pop, a very rapid pace of in-migration that would be similar to the in-migration that we experienced in some of the most rapidly growing periods of the late 90s. and then slowing down after that to a more leisured pace of net inflow of population, consistent with a model of an aging population, an aging society, and frankly, just fewer and fewer people eligible to move to a county like St. Croix. Second model is a steady in-migration model. Does not assume a pop from the bridge, but is a steady in-migration model, much higher than the current rate of growth, but consistent with the migration that we saw in migration rates saw during the 1980s. Model 3 is a rapid growth from now until 2025, basically a 10-year period of extremely rapid growth, matching the most rapid rate of in-migration that we have seen over time, followed by a moderating rate of in-migration thereafter, and consistent with an aging population. Model 4 is basically taking the most rapid rate of growth that we have seen in history, and just assuming that's going to start right now and continue on through 2050. That would be sort of a maximum rate of in-migration. The other model not shown here would be a zero migration model that could be used. That's basically just a very slow pace of growth that's based totally on natural increase, and I think that model 4 would represent the two most extreme kinds of possibilities. I don't see St. Croix County as a population decline county like we see in some parts of western Minnesota or northern Wisconsin and other parts of the upper Midwest. Going back, showing a graph of the four models with history going back to 1990, can see that the two lowest lines, that Model 1 and Model 2, are the two lowest lines. It's hard to distinguish them, so I'm going to compress the scale here in just a second, but the Model 3 is sort of an in-between and a fairly strong growth. That Model 4 is like I say, sort of the outward most extreme kind of assumption that I could come up with as to I don't think that's a realistic line, but at least you would see what would look like if you simply assume that the fastest couple-year rate of growth ever was going to continue for 40 years, and that's what it would look like. The official state is also in this graph, but you don't see it because it happens to be under that Model 3. I did not intentionally do that. I didn't look at the official state until after I came up with these four models, but that comes very, very close to the projection that has been done by the Applied Population Lab in Madison. You can see on the two lower ones that if we assume that for that Model 1, if we assume that growth is delayed for the next 5 years, that basically we would look at very little population growth over the next 5 years, followed by a rapid pop that would then bring that back up to approximately the Model 2, and those tend to be fairly consistent with each other. The projected change over the next 10 years, and my apologies, your handout shows 2005 to 2015. That's wrong. I just did this graph in a hurry early this afternoon and realized that I had the wrong heading on it. but the numbers are correct. Looking at the next 10 years, that Model 1 would show about a 7,400 person growth in St. Croix County, and the Model 2 growth would show about an 8,100 growth in population. Model 3 and Model 4, both assuming the sort of the peak rate of net in-migration over the next 10 years would show the same level of population increase over the next 10 years at 17,900 people. That is a fairly substantial rate by comparison to what we saw in the latter part of the 90s and into the aughts. The average or the total growth from 2005 to 15 estimated is about 10,900 people. And you can see that these models would give you rather substantially different rates of net migration and approximately the same amount of natural increase. That's the number of children born minus the number of people who die each year. If we focus on the three alternative projections for St. Croix County, excluding that most rapid rate of growth, Model 4, we see is that there are differences between that Model 3 and the official state projection, but by 2040 they are pretty much equal in population. And then this series takes it out, the red line with the gold diamonds takes that out beyond to 2050. And you'll notice that there's a curving offward in the rate of growth, and that's largely due to the aging of the population, and it's consistent with expectations of what's going to happen in the future on a state and national basis. Also looked a bit at areas that are most likely to be impacted by bridge-related development. Closest to the bridge are Somerset City and Somerset Township, St. Joseph Township, and North Hudson City. And these communities and townships accounted for about 17% of the total county population and 15% of growth in the past decade, with that growth slowing down from the 1990s, where they had a higher proportion of total county growth. If we add in New Richmond City, Richmond Township, and Star Prairie City and Township as sort of the expanded bridge impact area, that area includes about 35% of the total population of the county and 38% of the growth of the population. And those numbers are actually fairly consistent over a period of time. That 38% of the growth would imply that there is a slight increase in the proportion of the county that is living in those communities. But if we take those numbers as fixed, we can look at the implied projection. If we assume a 38% of the county growth is in those communities, we can project that area outward, and focusing in, we can see that graph gives you a little bit better idea of how those numbers differ. Or if that area maintains a constant proportion of the county population, then these numbers give you a sense of what that implies for the area. Those assumptions can, of course, be relaxed. I don't really have any basis for assuming a higher proportion than 38% of total county growth, like I say, that has been a fairly consistent number over the last 5 decades, as has the proportion of the county in those communities. But it would be possible without much difficulty, to look at a higher number or a lower number if there's a desire to look at that. And I don't want to really talk about this right now, but some people may, particularly schools and other organizations, may be interested in the impact that the projections would have on that a projected population would have on the age profile and specific age and gender groups, and looking over the next 5 years using that Model 3, are over the next 25 years using Model 3. We can see the pink area there would be the growth in those age groups, and there would be a tremendous over the next 25 years, consistent with what we're seeing in Minnesota and Wisconsin and nationally, a huge increase in the number of people over age 60, but in general, a overall population increase, including some increases in young adults and in school age population, based upon an overall net inflow of people into the county. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions or thoughts or. Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at
what millennials think. Okay, I'm over 30, so it's hard for me to understand exactly what millennials think. I really have tried to understand that. And if anybody's interested, there is actually a series of podcasts on NPR called Minnesota Next that in which I explored the millennial generation with an interviewer from public radio, if you want to have an extra 6 hours to spend. There's a lot of information about millennials, and a lot of surveys have been taken. What we generally try to do is to compare them at the same point in the life cycle as previous generations, at the same age and the same point in their life cycle. As Gen X was at that point, as the boom generation, as the silent generation, as the greatest generation were at that same point in their lives. And surveys have been done for a long time on things like this. They're really quite different. And by saying they're quite different, this is not 100%, but in relative proportions, they're substantially higher likelihood of wanting to live in major metropolitan area or within a closer, more densely settled area, rather than moving outward. And that's part of the reason why we haven't seen this. Let me see if I can. Okay, I just killed my thing here, but that's okay. I'll get back to the right slide here faster. Okay. That part of what we've seen here, and this is part of the confusion, we've seen monumental economic effects. We've seen dramatic changes in the housing market that are really unprecedented. This was from 2006 on, was a terribly tumultuous time. At the same time, we are also seeing a rapid aging of the population that is influencing people's behavior, and a younger generation that seems to be dramatically different than the previous generations, and they're behaving differently on a number of dimensions. Housing is certainly one of them. They're less likely to buy a house, and when they do buy a house, it's more likely to be in a central city or an inner ring suburb, an existing house along an older house. One of the things, I tried this on with the young woman that was interviewing me. She's a millennial. And I said, you know, one of the things that always just totally baffled me about remodeling was, yeah, and you'll probably laugh at this, but the idea of cutting molding. I can't wrap my mind around really cutting molding. And yet millennials seem to really want to do this. They want to do, you know, it's basically do it yourself. You know, they want to learn how to do these things. And she said, oh, that's the one thing I really have always wanted to do. And this was not planned, actually. We didn't actually rehearse that. You know, that they really are quite different on a number of dimensions. Marriage, family, timing of housing purchase, where, type of housing, things like that, having children. All that is quite different. When I was a young person, you met and you dated for a while, and then you would get married, and then you would think about a joint checking account, not before, and maybe after that think about a dog or a cat, and then you get a house and jobs, and then you get you have a child. Well, the tendency now is, and this is a very large number of people, is to meet, move in together, have a kid, get a dog, get a joint checking account, buy a house, and only a small proportion think about marriage. And formal marriage has become actually almost like instead of a cornerstone of the family, has become almost like a capstone of a relationship. It's really a very radically different kind of concept, and a very different kind of sequencing. And so what exactly they're going to do? Will they always be like this? I don't know. And that's part of the question that everybody has. And if I knew the answer to that, every marketing company in the country would be on my doorstep, because I don't have the answer to that. Will that outward expansion of metropolitan areas resume like it did before? Will we go back to this kind of environment that we see back here, somewhere out in here? I don't know. But right now, it's looking less and less likely. The longer this goes like this, the less and less likely it appears that we will move back to this kind of environment. That would suggest a continuing growth, but a more moderated growth in St. Croix County than we saw, for example, in the late 90s and early aughts. So a lot of balls up in the air. But I think that's the most reasonable assumption for growth into the future. Yeah. Okay. Yes. And we only have another hour. So I'm sorry, that's one of the areas that I really focused on for a number of years, was workforce related issues. We have an unusual circumstance right now where we have record numbers of people retiring. Today is not like anything we have ever seen in the past. There is nothing about today in the next couple decades that will be anything like you have ever seen in the history of St. Croix County and the history of Wisconsin or Minnesota, the history of the United States or the history of the world. Things are really, really different right now. There are a number of factors that are operating here. One is that the number of people leaving the workforce for retirement is at record numbers. The number of young people entering the workforce is a much lower number, and that would tend to indicate a declining unemployment rate. But we have an unusual situation where there are a number of people in our society who are mismatched in the workplace. There are jobs that with the Great Recession simply ceased to exist or began to dramatically gear down. If you go to a grocery store now, how many of the lanes in a large grocery store, how many of the lanes are check out yourself lanes? Well, what happened to those people that used to work there? There aren't any jobs like that anymore. And there are going to be fewer and fewer jobs like that in the future. That we see an expansion of the number of checkout yourself lanes. There's concerns that if we raise wages too high, for example, in fast foods, and this is a very legitimate concern, I'm all for higher wages, but if we raise them too high, that jobs will be replaced by robotics. And there are actually tipping points. Right now, you can hire a robot for $25,000 a year that can do the same thing that most counter people in a fast food place do. That's a lot less than what people are costing their, what hiring a person cost. The reason why we haven't seen, I think the reason why we haven't seen more of a wholesale move to that kind of thing is that Americans just get a little freaked out by that. But we're looking at a young generation coming up that is very comfortable with electronics. We're looking at young people today that if you have a strong background in math, science, engineering, things like that, you can name your price anywhere. But if you are in a field that is declining, you can't get a job. I don't care how many applications you send out, because those jobs have simply ceased to exist. So we have increasingly a mismatch in the labor market. One of the things that we are beginning to see is that in the United States and Mexico, we are beginning to outcompete China for productivity adjusted productivity adjusted wage rate in manufacturing. And we're beginning to see companies onshore to the United States. Minnesota and Wisconsin are part of that pattern. We have highly productive workers, and China is facing a huge problem with an aging workforce, and by 2017, a declining workforce. So these are not simply small domestic issues. It's not just what's happening here in the county, it's what's happening globally and how that all factors in and what the implications are. But clearly you need jobs and need growth in at least economic opportunity. One of the other things that's happening with the millennials right now that tends to really goof things up a bit is the rise in the number of 1099ers. Probably most of you have no idea what I'm talking about by 10. Oh, you're talking about 1099ers. Oh, wonderful. Then I won't talk about them. But we're seeing a rise in the number of 1099ers, and one of the problems is there really aren't that great statistics on some of these things. You've got a new data set. So you've got all the statistics. So I'm going to stop right there and shut up about that because he's got all the answers. I don't have any answers to. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? I think, Amanda, we see this as a bit of an ongoing thing, not unlimited, but.
want to start today by building upon some of the information that was just shared with us. Certainly when we see those population projections, we're going to want to know what some of the economic impacts of those new residents might look like in our communities. And one of the tools that we're using is something called input-output analysis. Is anyone familiar with this? I know Eric is, obviously. Anyone else? Bill is? Okay. So we're using a tool called Implan, which the group actually used to be headquartered in Hudson. They were recently bought out by a firm in North Carolina, but so they have some local history. And what input-output models do is that they try and estimate the flow of goods and services in terms of dollars among different industries in the economy. So if you could think about the economy as a spreadsheet, we've got industries down one side that might be buyers of products, and then we've got industries across the top that might be suppliers of products, and where those two buyers and sellers meet, that's how much good or service they're purchasing from one another. Does that make sense? Okay. We can also estimate the sales by different industries to households and institutions. By institutions, I mean government institutions, schools, prisons, publicly run hospitals, and so on and so forth. And we can also look at how industries rely on factors of production, things like labor and capital. So what these models try and do is look at what's going on in the economy, and then when you shock the economy, how the rest of the sectors might respond to that shock. A shock could be a plant closing, it could be an increase in population, it could be all sorts of different economic occurrences that go on in a community. So that's kind of a big picture perspective, but I think it's important to really understand what we're trying to do here. So let me give you an example of what this modeling software actually looks like. So this is an example of what's called a balance sheet for construction of non-residential, commercial, and healthcare structures in Wisconsin. So what does this mean? So if we look at this, in the year 2011, this industry had total revenue in the state of Wisconsin of almost $1.3 billion, okay? That's that top line. Of that $1.3 billion of their revenue, almost $600 million of that went to goods and services that they purchased. So that construction sector had to buy all sorts of different types of goods and services in order to do their job. Part of that revenue also went to employee compensation, about 40% of it. Some of it went to business owners, what's known as proprietor income. Some of it went to what is called other property type income, which is investment income and other types of dividends and so on and so forth. And then part of it goes to taxes. Does that all make sense? Okay, and this is what percentage of that goes to each type of category. So what happens when a new project increases revenue? What happens to some of those lines? So say we get a big project that's a $10 million project. What might happen to some of those lines? You need to buy more goods and services, right? So inputs are going to go up. You're going to have to pay labor to do the goods, to do the project, so that's going to go up. Proprietor income will hopefully go up because there's additional profit being made, and so on and so forth. So we can look at what happens when a new project occurs or a new shock occurs to the economy. What happens when a project uses goods and services that come from outside the geographic region that we're talking about? Those dollars don't stay in the economy, right? They go elsewhere. So what these models try and do is estimate how those dollars might stay in a community or leak out of the community as well. So a closer look at the inputs, we said that of that input line, or of the total revenue, that almost 600 million of that went to inputs, and we can break that down in terms of how this construction sector purchases different goods and services. So of that total $589 million, 82.2 million of it went to architectural, engineering, related services. Some of it went to refined petroleum products, and on down the line. And this is just kind of the top level of the purchases that this sector makes. And we also know what percentage occurs in the local economy. So we know that of the architectural, engineering, related services, an estimated 85% of those come from within the state. We also look at refined petroleum products, 6.6 come from within the state. Well, that makes sense because we do not produce a lot of that product in the state of Wisconsin. So on down the line. So we can create a similar model for St. Croix County. Does this all make sense so far? Okay. And as we make these changes to the economy, whatever it may be, population growth, new construction, so on and so forth, what we see are those ripples throughout the economy. So we can see how different industries are affected by these new flows of dollars into a community. And what these ripples are known as are multipliers. So for every dollar that goes into a project, what share of that ripples throughout other sectors of the economy? And we can break these down into different effects, direct effects, those that are the effects that occur directly to the sector that we're talking about. So the construction sector, those would be the new jobs created directly within construction. There'd be the labor that's paid directly by the construction firm, and so on and so forth. We can also look at the indirect effects, and these are the dollars that ripple through business-to-business transactions and business-to-government transactions. So as construction sector buys different goods and services throughout the economy, they affect those industries as well. We also have what are called induced effects, and induced effects are the dollars that are spent in a community that are paid to the individuals that are working in the industry. So as we pay more construction workers different revenues, they're spending the money on things like gas and furniture and housing and so on and so forth, and these dollars ripple throughout the economy as well and create effects. And the total effect is the direct plus indirect and induced. Clear as mud, right? So let's go to an example. So one of the things that we can try and do, if we have a good handle on what household and population projections look like, is look at things like the estimated impact of new construction. Now, we have to be very careful when we're using these types of models because they're based on current purchasing patterns that go on among industries. As we just heard just a second ago, things can change very dramatically. They can, if we look at how people spend their money now, that's much different than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. So we have to kind of keep this in mind when we're looking at these numbers. So if we look at the potential economic impact in St. Croix County of $10 million in new residential construction, we can see that it has a direct effect of 77 jobs, labor income of almost 2.8 million, indirect and induced effects of 43 jobs, and a total effect of 120 jobs. So we can do this type of modeling once we have a sense of what the population estimates that we want to use actually look like. Now let me ask you, when we do this type of modeling, especially for things like construction, are these impacts short-lived or are they permanent? Or are they recurring? They're short-lived, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that it will spur the economy for a bit, but it's not going to last forever when we talk about this type of activity. We can also look at the impacts of new residents in terms of the income that they bring to a community. And one of the ways that this modeling system does is to look at how people spend money on different types of goods and services by different income levels. So this is an example from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it looks at how much people, this says food away from home, but it's actually food at home. This says how much people spend on food at home by different income brackets. So you can see that obviously people making less money spend a lot on less food, spend less money on food, and the more income you make, the more money that's spent on food purchased away from or purchased for the home, so things like grocery stores and so on and so forth. So if we know this type of expenditures, and we have some estimates in terms of what the household incomes are, we don't know what they'll look like in the future. They could be very different. We also know the distribution of incomes by different households in terms of what ranges of incomes that people currently have in households throughout the corridor. And we can make estimates of what expenditures might actually look like going forward and how these income levels might affect local communities. So just an example, and again, these are very preliminary. I wouldn't say these are permanent, and there's a lot of caveats with them. So if we use the 2015 to 2020 estimates for households and for income levels that we have based on the Wisconsin Department of Administration official projections, and we can say over this 5-year period from 2015 to 2020, we can say that the income generated by new residents is going to be split out like this. So we know that people spend money on food services, they spend money in hospitals, they spend money in retail stores, and so on and so forth. We can get a sense of how that might impact the rest of the economy. Are all these dollars going to stay within corridor communities, or some of them going to leak out? They'll leak out. So these are not all impacts that will occur directly to the corridor. The other thing here is that we see these employment numbers. These are not necessarily new employees. These should be viewed as supported employees. Some of these will be new. Some of these will be supporting existing employees in those different sectors. Does that all make sense? Okay. If you look at this list, this is just the top list. You can go down literally through 440 different categories. What do these have in common? Anything that jumps out to you? The service industry, exactly. So most of the impacts of households that we see from their income will occur in retail and service industries. No big surprise here. We can also step forward and go 2015 to 2025, and I would, again, put a ton of caveats on these numbers. We do not know what spending patterns will look 5 years from now, much less 10 years from now, but we can do a similar type of analysis and see what it looks like. Any questions on that? Bill, you look like you have something to say. No? Okay. So certainly we can look at some of the economic impacts in terms of jobs, in terms of revenue, in terms of new income that comes into a community. We also have to think about the costs that go along with new residents. There's costs that are associated with them as well. This is one of the charts that we showed last time with some of the comparable communities we looked at. I should say we have 3 new bridges that we've identified that we will be using along with this. We have one in Virginia Beach, we have one in Kansas City, and one in the Tampa area that we'll look at as well. This looked at kind of the population trends of these comparable counties, both before and after they had their bridge projects. And obviously one that we focused a lot on is Scott County, Minnesota, with the Bloomington Ferry Bridge in Shakopee. And we saw the strong growth before and after the bridge, obviously. Let's look at the change in local government employment, both before and after. So this is percent change in employment in local government since 1980. And we can see that really in Scott County, Minnesota, local government employment grew dramatically, both before and after. So these are teachers, these are firefighters, these are police officers, these are public works people. These are people that are there to support the new population. And I'm actually surprised it jumped that much that early. I don't know if there was something that occurred around 1990, but it occurred dramatically in Scott County, Minnesota. We see a very similar trend in St. Charles, Missouri, where we saw pretty dramatic growth, and dramatic growth also in local government employment. So certainly with new residents come costs that we have to account for as well. Any questions on those? Does that surprise you? No? And again, this is just local government. This isn't state government or federal government. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're creating as part of this, this is something that Lindsay had been working on quite a bit, is this fiscal impact tool that will allow you to kind of look at the costs and benefits of different development that goes on in a community. And we're using a methodology that balances what's called a per capita multiplier methodology and a marginal cost approach. So what we're trying to do is look at current costs of public service per resident and households and multiplying those by the expected number of new residents or households. We can adjust it. They don't have to be current costs. If we know what costs might look like going down the line, we can actually adjust those numbers, but it just kind of gives us a good starting point. All the numbers in these tools are adjustable. We don't have to rely on them in terms of what the actual numbers are right now. We can also do expected revenues using a similar type of methodology. So if we knew property tax revenue, sales tax revenue, other things that are generated by these residents, we can build these into the model to see what the revenues might look like. And then we can also look at the current capacities. And a lot of fiscal impact tools kind of stop at this point. They look at the new revenues, they look at the new costs, but they don't look at the current capacities that exist in communities. So if we know that our school district is close to capacity or has a lot of excess capacity, that'll change how we assess some of these outcomes. If we know our sewer district and so on and so forth has excess or limited capacity, that'll adjust our outcomes here as well. And those capacities are assessed through one-on-one input with local department heads or other people that have knowledge of what the current situation looks like for those types of public works. And again, these can be run in an iterative manner. So we don't have to just plug them in based on what the numbers are now and just let them go. They can be run on a yearly basis, or they can also be run on a project-by-project basis. So if there is a new development that's coming online and you want to know what the impacts might look like, these tools can be pulled out. Just to give you a sense of what they look like, this is kind of the beta version. So it's got a number of spreadsheets where you plug in your amounts for expenditures, for assessed values and different types of, it'll calculate the per capita values, residential, non-residential, skip over that. Operating costs, debt service, revenue sources of different types. Back out of here a little bit. Oops. And this is the one that we still have a little editing to do, and that's shared revenue, because it's very, very difficult to estimate. But I would ask if there is anyone in this room that kind of wants to beta test some of these and play around with them. I would be more than open to that. If there are people that have a lot of interest in this, I mean, we can make it available to everyone, but if there are folks that really want to take a look at it, I'm more than happy to share it with them and kind of get their feedback. So we don't have to answer right now. If you want to think on it, I can take your name down after the meeting and we can take a look at that. So we kind of looked at how residents might influence the economy in terms of new residents that the bridge might facilitate one way or the other. We can also look at how the bridge might influence other sectors of the economy. So this is one perspective on site selection criteria. So these are from site selection consultants, and they're interviewed on an annual basis by Area Development Magazine. This is just one perspective. There's lots of different ways that people can take a look at this and rank what's important to businesses when they're deciding where to locate. It's obviously going to vary by the type of business as well, the scale of business, and so on and so forth. But this is what the consultants say, based on the companies that they're working with, in terms of what's most important to firms that are deciding a new site to locate. And this is the ranking. Number 1 is availability of skilled labor. Number 2 is highway accessibility. Number 3 is state and local incentives. 4 is available land. 5 is labor costs. And also tied with 5 is proximity to major markets. These are individuals, these are firms that either rank these factors as either being very important or important in terms of what they look for in a site. Does that jump out at anyone? Does anything surprise there? It varies. And I'm not sure they do a lot of crosstabs, but it's a sampling. So it's manufacturing of different sizes, it's professional technical services, it's warehousing distribution, it's retail, and so on and so forth. So it's a good question. So in theory, improved highway accessibility allows for things like smaller inventories, so you can do a better job of doing just-in-time delivery, so you don't have to have all this space to keep products that you need in your production process. It reduces per hour mile costs of transporting goods. So one of the things that you see when there's congestion is that if you're paying people on an hourly basis to get their products from point A to point B, if you're idling and sitting in traffic, it's going to increase your costs. It also allows businesses to draw supplies from a wider area, potentially lowering costs and improving quality assurance. So some things to keep in mind. Yes? So that's going to vary again by firm and firm type. So it could be a manufacturing firm looking for CNC operators, or it could be a computer programming firm looking for new JavaScripters, or it can vary. There's a huge exactly. But there is a category that's unskilled labor. So these are people that have specific skills that they're looking for, not the people that are doing cashiers and other things like that. Exactly. This is the second sheet of these rankings, and you get kind of on down the line where you see occupancy of construction costs, available buildings, and so on and so forth. You also see these quality of life factors that they've ranked separately. So some of the things that are ranked very high in terms of what companies are looking for is access to college and universities in the area, low crime rates, ratings of public schools, housing costs, and so on and so forth. Most of the time, these are secondary considerations. They're not primary considerations. And a lot of times, these are considerations of the business owner that's actually looking to move into a community. It's not so much of their workers. So I guess as you look at these, and you don't have to answer this right now, how many of these factors could be leveraged by the presence of the new river crossing, or regardless of it? I mean, there's a lot of these factors that communities might actually have going for them already, whether or not the bridge is actually there. So think about that in terms of what these communities have to offer in terms of a business location, both because of the bridge as well as regardless of the bridge. I think there's a lot of things as we look at these where a lot of the communities in the corridor would rank fairly high, and in St. Croix County in general. Any thoughts on that? Okay. When we think about site selection, though, that is a pretty limited view of economic development. Companies that are relocating or moving to a community. So this looks at components of job growth, and these are the 15 states that grew the fastest in terms of employment growth rates from the year 1995 to the year 2012. And this uses the new database that I'll talk about here in a second. So depending upon which data source you use, these rankings may change, but for the most part, you'll see a lot of these states up on the top in terms of highest percentage growth rate in jobs. And we can break down the creation of jobs into 3 different categories. Jobs that came from net expansion of companies, of existing companies. Jobs that come from net openings, so jobs that are created by new businesses that are starting versus those that are closing. And jobs that are created by net relocation, so companies moving into a community versus out of a community. And this is a state level, so it's going to be a little bit different, but let's just take a look at these different components. Here's a share of jobs that comes from net expansions. Here's a share of jobs that comes from net openings. Here's a share of jobs that comes from net relocations on a state basis. Anyone see that? Very little. And most of the states that are growing fast, most of their net jobs, very little comes from relocations. Now again, that's on a state basis, so these are companies moving across state lines. And the fact is, a lot of companies, a lot of large companies specifically, they do make moves, but they're few and far between on a whole. That's true, that's absolutely right, which is, I think, an emphasis of a lot of people that are looking at economic development policy. How do we create more businesses, not just jobs? Entrepreneurs, startups. It's an area where Wisconsin has not traditionally done a lot. So we can break this down for the 16 counties in the Minneapolis MSA as well and look at these same types of components. And here's where we do see more net relocations coming into play, companies moving from point A to point B, which makes sense. They might be moving from one point to another within the metro area. They might be coming from a different place into the metro area and so on and so forth. But again, when we see the most jobs are created by net expansions and net openings. But relocations are important as well for some of these counties. We do see Scott being the highest in terms of percentage on both a total basis as well as the share that comes from net relocations. We see St. Croix is kind of there in the middle and so on down the line. And I broke them down into which their geographic area, whether they're central county or an outlying county. But for the most part, most of the jobs are going to come from expansions of companies and new startups. There's another category of startups I'll get to here in a second. Does this surprise anyone? No? Yes? Maybe? Scott is where the Bloomington Ferry Bridge is. I mean, it is, but I think a better way to do it would be to look at it by industry to see if there are industries that are serving new population, like we saw on some of the impact charts earlier, whether to see their export-based industries, their businesses that are selling goods and services outside of their own community. Yes. Well, and we can dig into this a little bit more. But it's really going to vary by size of firm, by type of firm, and so on and so forth. And as we saw in the criteria before, the price of land, availability of land, it's certainly a factor. We can't deny that. And we can think about that as a potential advantage that maybe the corridor could offer, especially in terms of prices, and in variability and scale of sites and locations too. But again, that's assuming that people want that growth, that we have to keep that in mind too. I mean, and if you, and you see this in a lot of, in metropolitan areas in the central counties, you'll see these lower growth rates, and that's no big surprise. So you see that in Hennepin and Ramsey. These are counties that are built out for the most part. They have high land prices because of the types of real estate they offer. So that's not surprising at all that you see those types of differences in the central, or especially the core counties versus the suburban and exurban counties. And I bet if you went to most robust growing metropolitan areas in the country, you'd see a very similar pattern as this. And this is where we get into some of the 1099 information. We can break down companies into different business stages as well. And we can break them down into what are called self-employed individuals, or those that receive a 1099 for their income tax statement. They're sole proprietors, their small-scale business activities that are often conducted in homes, and so on and so forth. I bet you would be in here. This is from a data set called the National Establishment Time Series data set. And this is a data set that tracks every company in the country since 1995 based on their DUNS number. So it's not going to be every firm in there, but anytime that you do a business registration, apply for a loan, or do any sort of business activity, Dun & Bradstreet's probably calling you or checking on you, and they're giving you a DUNS number, whether you know it or not. And what this data set does is it's able to track those firms longitudinally starting in 1995 going forward. So it knows if they died, whether they opened, what industry they're in, how many people they employed in a given year, whether they made a move. There's a ton of information in there. And you can get some of the aggregated data from a website called youreconomy.org. We actually have access to the raw data now. I can't do extracts, but we can do specific summaries if there's information that you're interested in, and dig into this a little bit more. But I get a little sidetracked here, but essentially it allows us to look at these companies in different stages. Self-employed, stage 1, which are 2 to 9 employees, which are often partnerships and lifestyle businesses and startups. Stage 2 companies, which are 10 to 99 employees. Stage 3, which tend to be larger companies, 100 to 499. And very large companies, which would be stage 4, which is 500 employees or more. And I'm not going to go through all this right now, but you can kind of read what some of these companies might be dealing with in terms of their operations, what they might need. This is it's going to vary by firm and by industry, but it kind of gives you a sense of some of the issues they may be dealing with. And if we look at the distribution of employment by these different business stages, we see that for the most part, it's those stage 2 firms that account for the most employees. They're the most of them, and they account for the biggest share of employment. And in St. Croix County, it's actually a bigger share than we see in the metro area and in the United States. Stage 1 is a high share as well. Stage 3 is a high share, and stage 4 is somewhat similar to 3 in a lot of instances. But in St. Croix County, you actually have no employers right now that are stage 4 companies. I actually think the county of St. Croix was the only one at one point, and I don't think it still is. And there have been other ones in the past, but right now, that's where you are. That's in 2013. So let's look at how these stages have changed over time. If we look at total employment in the United States from 1995 to the year 2012 and look at them by these different stages, here's the self-employed. A lot of these would be those 1099 individuals. We do see a steady increase throughout the previous decade. We see a little blip starting with the Great Recession. We actually see it pick up after then. A lot of these individuals here are so-called necessity entrepreneurs. They probably lost their jobs and were forced into contracting and doing other things because they needed to keep their income. As the economy improved, you see it come back down, but it still is much higher than it was 15 years ago. These are stage one. So stage one has seen fairly steady growth. You obviously see the blips around the recessionary periods, but for the most part has steadily grown in terms of total employment. That's stage two. Stage two is by far the biggest source of employment in the United States. Stage two establishments. Here's stage three. We actually see it start to decline, beginning with the 01 recession. We see it pick back up in a little bit. But this coming back up isn't so much because there are many new stage three firms that are being formed. It's because stage four, many of the stage four firms are actually dropping into stage three. So there are fewer employees now working in very large establishments than there were in the year 2000. And you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. The companies go to scale, they're trying to increase productivity, there's new technologies. They're not necessarily going to try and do that by adding jobs. They're probably going to do that by shedding jobs to make profits because they can keep their productivity levels at where they are or higher with fewer employees, and it brings their costs down. So what's this mean for St. Croix County? Here's your pattern. It's pretty similar to the United States with that lack of stage four. If we think about the site selection criteria and think about what the corridor might offer, what might this distribution say to you? What types of sites might we be talking about? What might companies want? I mean, some of them might want that big 80-acre piece of property to expand on, but a lot of the jobs that will be created, most likely, will be smaller. They'll be in smaller firms. So let's look at establishments relocating to the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington MSA by business stage. So these are firms that relocated from one place or another into the MSA by a different stage. We look at the MSA because when people do site selection, they typically start at the regional level first. They're not looking at specific communities. They're looking at a metro area or a region or a state or something, and then they narrow it down in geographies from there. So if we look at the establishments that relocated to the MSA over this, this period, we can see that on average, the stage four companies, there's about 5 a year. So you have about 5 to 6 a year that you're competing with among all the other communities in the MSA, or a large number of communities in the MSA. So when you think about what your communities have to offer, you have to think about how it might be differentiated from these other places. Where are most of the relocations? Where do they come from? Stage one, stage two, self-employed individuals. So these are small businesses and entrepreneurs that are relocating from one place to another. So again, when we think about the types of sites that might be needed or desired, it's not that you're not trying to go for those big firms, but it's the little firms that are much more frequent. We can look at another type of location decision made by what are called expansion startups, and these are startups by existing companies. So they might be spin-offs, they might be chains, they might be a Target deciding where to locate a new store, and so on and so forth. So again, there is a site selection factor that goes into these types of decisions that are made by these different firms. And we do see more activity among stage 4 and stage 3 firms in terms of existing firms that are trying to locate new facilities, whatever they may be. But again, most of the type of activity that comes from expansion startups, and it varies by year obviously, but comes from those stage 1, stage 2 firms. Does that surprise anyone? So one thing we can do is think about how the corridor might be positioned or aligned with the needs of specific industries. So we talked about the Highway 370 corridor, we talked about some of the other projects around the country. How can we think about what the corridor can offer as a whole to companies that might be considering either expansion opportunities or new locations, or entrepreneurs that might be considering a location in the corridor? What can we offer them? Do they have a locational advantage in terms of their transportation needs? Are there industries that might be most aligned with the transportation modes that would use the river crossing? Are there industry clusters in the region that the corridor communities could better align with? And are there opportunities for things like reverse commuting as well? We talk a lot about people that are going from Wisconsin to Minnesota for employment, but are there opportunities that open up going the other way as well? So this map looks at freight flows by different transportation modes, by highway, railroad, and waterways. The thicker the line, the more transportation that occurs in that corridor. The brown areas that you see are railroads. The reds that you see are interstate highways. The grays are non-interstate highways, and the blues obviously are inland waterways. So you see things like this huge rail corridor that comes from Wyoming into the central part of the country. That's coal coming from the Powder River Basin. And I would bet in 10 years, you're not going to see that anymore, or at least in that magnitude. But if you look at where some of the key highway corridors and interstate highways are, one of the things you'll notice is that there's a key corridor that goes from Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area to Chicago, and it goes a little bit to the west, but it dies off considerably going to the west coast. And so there is freight that's obviously moving from Minneapolis to the west coast, but it's in much lower volume than it is going from Minneapolis to Chicago and other places. One of the reasons for that is that you see the overland bridge that comes from a lot of the container ships that come into places like Long Island. They'll be put onto rail trucks there, or onto rail cars there, and they'll ship them all the way across the country, or they'll transload them in Chicago and so on and so forth. So again, that's just not a huge freight corridor from east to west in the northern part of the country. So we can look at this a little bit with a little less noise on the map. So we can just look at average daily long-haul truck traffic on the national highway system. And again, you kind of see that similar pattern. You see that pretty thick corridor between Minneapolis, St. Paul, down to Chicago. You see a little bit extending west out of Minneapolis, but again, it's much lower in volume than you see in other parts of the country. So most of the freight that's going from Minneapolis, a lot of it actually goes east. It doesn't go west. These are major freight corridors that are identified by the Federal Highway Administration. It just narrows it down a little bit more. And you see that major corridor that's going from Minneapolis to Chicago. It's not going the other way. So if you're a company that's depending upon Western markets, this probably isn't a place you're considering located. If you're really dependent on Western markets, you're probably going to locate on the other side of the metro area because you don't have to deal with it. But if you are considering Chicago or Eastern markets, it makes a lot of sense. The other place I think it makes a lot of sense to consider is the metro area itself. It provides access to the metro area in terms of intra-metro goods and services movement. So we can look at industries that depend the most on truck transportation in terms of their total value of shipments. And here's where you see things like wholesale jump out dramatically. Most of the share of sales that are, or share of shipments that are made by wholesalers are made by truck. And I'll show you another chart here that looks at average distance that are made. But you certainly see things like plastics and rubber food manufacturing, and so on and so forth. These are industries that are very highly dependent upon transportation in terms of trucks. And this is just, again, the top dozen or so, and this keeps on going down the line. We can look at it in terms of total tonnage, and again, you see things like wholesalers, you see some other manufacturers in there as well, warehousing and storage, and so on and so forth. Again, very highly dependent in terms of their total shipments on trucks. This is average shipment distance by these different industries in terms of their truck transportation. Wholesalers, most of the wholesale distances are very, very small. So most of them are made in the local market area. So if you're thinking about how the corridor communities might benefit in terms of a location, these might be some of the industries that might take advantage of that because they're dependent upon local markets. They're dependent upon access to markets, particularly in the metro area. And again, this keeps on going down the line. This looks at a bigger picture corridor, and it looks at other types of transportation facilities that are available. So we can look at things like intermodal facilities. There is a BNSF intermodal facility in St. Paul. It's actually off Highway 36. It's between Highway 36 and I-94. Does it place you an advantage of having access to that facility, being in the corridor versus other places? I don't know, but it's something to consider. These are the types of industries that depend the most on multimodal, rail, and truck deliveries. So you see things like primary metal manufacturing, you see paper manufacturing. A lot of these aren't ones that are highly concentrated here, obviously, but you kind of get a sense of the types of industries that might benefit from having access to multimodal transportation. And again, it's a pretty low share compared to some of the other volumes that we see. Certainly have access to the airport as well. These are industries that depend very highly on air. So again, you kind of get a sense of what they may look like. You see some different industries here. You see computer and electronic manufacturing. You see commercial equipment wholesalers. You see electronic shopping and mail order houses. Again, does it give you a locational advantage here versus other places? Not necessarily, but it's something to consider. The other thing to think about is how corridor communities might tie into existing concentrations of firms that are in the region. And there's been a ton of cluster studies that have been done, certainly for Wisconsin, some that have come out of the Humphrey Institute at University of Minnesota. So we kind of know what some of the clusters are in the region, but we can certainly look at some of the other concentrations that may be present. So this looks at industries with the highest national share of establishments within 100 miles of St. Croix County and a minimum of 50 establishments. We use 100 miles because that's a proxy for short haul trucking distances, orders that can be made in one day there and back. No big surprise, we see things like dairy product manufacturing, computer and peripheral equipment manufacturing, residential care facilities, that's driven by population, obviously. A lot of manufacturing. Again, these are just the top. We literally have 250 different industries that we can share with you to give you a sense of what industries are concentrated in the region. So it kind of gives communities a sense of what types of industries they might be tapping into in terms of concentration, but also in terms of what supply chains may look like. I'll go into that in just a second. So we can look at concentrations of industries. So other fabricated metal product manufacturing, that was one that was pretty highly concentrated here. It's not as highly concentrated as places like Chicago, but you do see it somewhat concentrated in the Twin Cities metro area. And we can look at the supply chain for those industries to get a sense of what types of goods and services they're actually purchasing. So we can get a sense of what their suppliers may look like as well. So if there's opportunities to tie into supply chains for concentrations of industries, we can give this information to corridor communities to kind of let them know what the suppliers may be for some of these firms. Another example that's highly concentrated here, navigational measuring and electromedical and control instruments. Fairly high concentration here, again, not as high as you see in some other places, but it is one of the core industries in terms of location quotients and establishments. Again, we can look at what their supply chains are to see if there's opportunities there. And finally, we can think about how we might position the region in terms of occupational and educational structure. We can break jobs down into what are known as different job zones. And this is from a data source called ONET. I don't know if you're familiar with this. ONET, okay. And these are based on national distributions. So we have to think about how they might differ locally. But what ONET does is it breaks all the occupations in the country down into 1 of 5 job zones. Job zone 1 are occupations that require very little or no preparation. Those would be things like the cashiers that we talked about before. These types of jobs are disappearing. There's a much lower share of those jobs available now than there was 10 years ago. Job zone 2 are occupations that require some preparation, typically require a high school diploma and previous work-related skill experience, knowledge, and so on, so forth. Job zone 3 is medium preparation. These are jobs that require probably some training in a vocational school or on-the-job type of experience, typically require things like an associate's degree or a certificate. They require 1 to 2 years of on-the-job experience to do their job effectively. and they may include a recognized apprenticeship program. These where a lot of jobs are being created right now. These are what are called so-called middle skill jobs. These are where a lot of the jobs are occurring right now. Job Zone 4 and Job Zone 5 are those that require considerable preparation or extensive preparation. These are jobs that typically require either a bachelor's degree or beyond bachelor's, some sort of professional degree or a graduate degree, and so on and so forth. I want to focus on those Zone 4 and Zone 5 jobs here in just a second. And again, this is a generalization. This is kind of a vertical measurement of skills using educational attainment. We have to look at this in more detail. But if you look at the share of individuals that have a bachelor's degree or higher in St. Croix County, and you look at the share of individuals that have a bachelor's degree or higher in Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area, excluding St. Croix County and Pierce County, Minneapolis-St. Paul has one of the highest shares of the population age 25 and over with bachelor's degrees in the entire country. It's in the top 20. If we look at the jobs or industries that typically require a high share of individuals working in those Job Zone 4 and Job Zone 5 type of occupations, we see things like financial markets, we see educational services, we see professional and technical services, we see data processing, we see telecommunications, and so on and so forth. These are the industries that require the highest share of occupations that are in Job Zone 4 and Job Zone 5 in the entire country. So these are primarily located in financial, business services, and professional technical services. This was a chart I showed last time. This looks at St. Croix County location quotients from 1995 to 2012. And again, location quotient, if you're above the national average employment in that industry, you're above 1. If you're below the national average in terms of your share of employment in that industry, you're below 1. If we look across the board in terms of those industries that require a high share of individuals with a college degree, their information, financial activities, professional and business services. Those are all industries where St. Croix County has a significantly lower location quotient. These are also industries that have a very high location quotient in the Twin Cities metro area, many of them anyway. So what's stopping St. Croix County from growing these industries, given your access to college-educated individuals? And that's a generalization. We have to dig a bit deeper there, but what's the opportunity for getting people coming the other way across the bridge instead of just going that way? So I think when you're thinking about how to position the communities, if that is something you're actually interested in, here are some industries we can dig into in more detail and see what some of the barriers may be to developing those, because they are growth industries. They are those high knowledge industries that are growing, and they are ones that tend to be below average in St. Croix County. Yes? I actually mapped broadband. I have it on my computer. I can show it to you. Broadband is one of those things that it's not a simple yes or no. It depends upon upload speeds, download speeds. It depends upon data volumes. It depends upon industries. In terms of coverage, you have pretty good coverage, but it may be an issue of price. It may be an issue of maximum upload or download speed. So those are some things we can dig into. Yeah.
I think a major factor is that we are in a society heavily to manufacturing. Very, very, very close proximity. A couple decades ago, decided that was the future. Focused on those clusters. We're trying to get at or catch up. And we will be catching up. Priority.
And one of the things that, and you may disagree with me on this, but one of the biggest drivers of Minnesota's success in those isn't necessarily the state of Minnesota, it's the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. If you look at the share of population that's located in Minneapolis-St. Paul, the share of Minnesota's population that's located there, it's about 2/3 of the state, a little over 2/3. Milwaukee has about 30% of our share. So these are industries that tend to co-locate in very large dynamic metropolitan areas. So that's a potential advantage for you that other parts of the state may not have because they don't have that huge access to talent and those co-location of firms. You think about land prices, you think about other things, you know, there's some opportunities there. Any other questions? Yeah. Sure. If you have a location, what location quotients do is look at the share of employment in an industry relative to the share of that same industry's employment at the national level. So if you have the same share of employment in an industry as a nation, you'd be at 1. So if you're above 1, you have a higher relative share of employment in that industry. If you're below 1, you have a lower relative share. Oh, I'm sorry. One's from, sorry. One's 1995 and one's 2012. What it does show is that the location quotients are increasing with the exception of professional and business services. But because the location quotient is increasing doesn't always mean that employment is increasing here. It may be that it's decreasing at the national level and not decreasing here. So, but nonetheless, it is becoming more concentrated on a relative sense. Yes, Eric. We have those numbers. We could certainly pull them out. We have trend lines in terms of employment and so on and so forth. Absolutely. And these are very high-level location quotients. We can dig in much more detail, too, in terms of industries. The other thing, too, is that a colleague of mine who's no longer with us that was at UW-Madison, we hear a lot about Wisconsin's per capita income situation relative to the United States. And he looked at Minnesota's per capita income relative to the United States, and you see Minnesota has a higher per capita income than the national average and has been kind of going up, but a steady trend going up over the last 15 years or so. I think it's at about 107% of the national average right now. Wisconsin's at about 96%. The difference in Wisconsin's per capita income and Minnesota's per capita income is explained by about 4 occupational categories that are concentrated in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. That's it. That's the complete difference. If you remove those occupations from Minnesota, it would bring them down to the national average. If you put those in Wisconsin, it would bring us up. And those are all located in those industries as well. Those 3. Mm-hmm. Well, they're occupations, so they're spread across different industries, but they're highly concentrated in those industries. What occupations? Computer programming, management, financial occupations, and one's escaping me right now. Legal is a little bit more concentrated, but the wage differential between legal here and there is not as big as, it may have changed over the course since the study was done, but it wasn't as big as some of these other occupational categories, especially management, which makes sense. You have a lot of headquartered companies in Twin Cities that probably have to pay a lot more for management than firms in other places. So again, what does all this mean for the corridor? It's thinking about how communities might work together to form a plan in terms of how they might benefit from accessibility that the bridge creates to access to this type of talent. And it gives them a sense of how they might want to direct their efforts in terms of growing specific sectors of the economy. It's not as simple as that, but it's better than a shotgun approach. The old saying of shoot anything that flies, claim anything that lands. So we have a lot of data, we have a lot of information, we're putting it into a report, but if there's more information that you would like to see, again, this is pretty high level, we'll throw the spreadsheets into the shared file, you can start to take a look at them. I'm sure Bill will have a lot of questions about them as well. I know he had to run. If you have questions in the ongoing discussion, if we want to have another conference call, let's certainly do that, yep. But again, it's about recognizing the fact that we don't know what the future holds, but by knowing what some of the trends are and what some of the data is, you can help guide that future. Any other questions? No, it's a ton, but thanks for your attention.